is willing to wipe out its leadership and nuclear test site. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump sent another message, and it's not likely to be viewed well here in Seoul. He said in a tweet, South Korea is finding, as I've told them, that their talk of appeasement with North Korea will not work. They only understand one thing, unquote. Now, CNN's Ian Lee joins me live with the latest, the reaction to the missile test and the reaction to this tweet sent by U.S. President Donald Trump, criticizing a key ally of appeasement. What is the reaction here to that?
Yeah, you know, when you have an international incident like this, you want to rally around the flag, get all your allies to come together, show a strong show of force, united front against whatever threat that is. And this tweet has a crack of daylight in it, where it shows there isn't this united front, or at least President Trump is tweeting out that is going to anger most Koreans about appeasement towards North Korea. Yes, it's true. President Moon, when he first came into power, talked about a dialogue and getting to the negotiating table with the North Koreans to resolve their conflict. But he's inherited a completely different situation where you have North Korea defiant about their nuclear program, and you also have President Trump who's talking tough as well. And President Moon has shown a strong hand in this crisis. But this isn't the only thing that's worrying Koreans right now. There's also reports that Donald Trump is looking at the free trade agreement between the United States and South Korea. And that also is something that the Koreans are going to be scratching their head at. What kind of ally would do that, especially now during this crisis, and especially since the United States put the THAAD anti-missile system here in South Korea? That angered the Chinese. The Chinese retaliated, and there has been economic troubles through that as well. And so to cut off that free trade agreement would just be adding salt to a wound.
Absolutely. It's incredible because at a time when key allies in the region, especially South Korea, are seeking reassurance from the United States, they're getting these signals from Donald Trump of an alliance that is being actively undermined. Now, separately, we have Secretary Mattis saying that he is promising a massive military response. I mean, that must generate some measure of concern here in Seoul. We're not that far away from the DMZ.
Yeah, Secretary of Defense Mattis now said that they were going to have a strong response, and he said that for any threat against the South Korea, the United States, or any ally of the United States. And that's the tough talk, though, we kind of expect from the United States when it comes to any threat towards a U.S. ally. And that's kind of the stable side of this relationship right now. We do have heard that President Trump's advisors have been saying, you know, when it comes to this tweet, when it comes to this breaking off of this free trade agreement, they say, don't do it now. We won't need this strong alliance. And that's what we're hearing from from Secretary of Defense Mattis, saying that, listen, we are with our allies, we're standing united together, and if North Korea tries anything, we're ready to respond.
Got it. Ian Lee, good to see you here in Seoul. We thank you for your reporting. Ian Lee there. Now, the International Nuclear Watchdog Agency, now, at the moment, before we go to Vienna, where we were hoping that Nick Robertson would be standing by, we do have a guest joining us from London to talk to us more about how South Korea is responding to North Korea's, not only that, but just the threat itself, the nuclear threat being posed. We have, as I've been mentioning before, this is what's happening today. Against the will of the world, North Korea has gone ahead and tested what it claims to be a hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb that it says is small enough to be able to be put on top of an ICBM missile. Of course, experts are still verifying that. And Nick, what is the Director General responding to? How is he responding to this latest nuclear test, the sixth test, and believed to be a hydrogen bomb test by North Korea?
Yeah, well, this is the man who sits atop the International Atomic Energy Agency, who has an absolute world view and a better grasp of these issues than perhaps anyone else. His response was, and it was a very swift response as well, is that this is an extremely regrettable act. It is against the expressed wishes of the international community. He reminds North Korea of its obligations under many UN resolutions, but most recently the UN resolution 2371, that North Korea should end its nuclear weapons program, should put everything that it has in that context beyond use, that it should do this in a verifiable way, an irreversible way. But of course, Yokoya Amano, the Director General here, is fully aware of the tense relationship with North Korea, the fact that it has broken its previous obligations in this regard. But he says, you know, the IAEA, in its role as a monitoring organization, as a role as an organization that can lend a hand if there is a diplomatic progress to oversee such an effective control and measurement of what North Korea is doing with its nuclear capacities on the ground in North Korea. He says this organization, the IAEA, stands by ready to help in that process. But his initial reaction is very, very clear. This is extremely regrettable, and obviously very big and broad concerns go with that. Christy?
Extremely regrettable. That's the reaction from Yokoya Amano, the Director General of the IAEA. Nick Robertson reporting live for us. We thank you. Let's get some nuclear expertise on board to figure out what's going on here. Martin Navius joins me now from London. He is a military expert at King's College London and the author of Nuclear Weapons and British Strategic Planning. And sir, thank you for joining us here on CNN. The North Koreans can make this claim of what they detonated on Sunday, but from what you're able to tell from the evidence available at this point, looking at the seismic readings, looking at the history of its nuclear tests, did they test a hydrogen bomb?
Well, that's going to, as you correctly say, that is going to take a few more weeks to determine definitively. What we can say with pretty much confidence now is that the magnitude of the blast was around 6.3, and you can extrapolate the yield of the bomb from that magnitude, and it was a pretty large bomb. The estimates I've seen are well over 100 kilotons. So it is quite possible that they either detonated a hydrogen thermonuclear bomb or a boosted fission weapon. Now, they detonated that explosive underground in tunnels. There have been some reports that the tunnel collapsed because of the blast. We can expect that over the next few weeks, some of the radionuclides will escape, and observers will test the atmosphere to see what kind of chemicals there have been released, and from that they will be able to make a definitive judgment. But I would say that with reasonable confidence, that if they have not tested it now, the way their program is progressing, that the rapidity and the deliberateness, if they don't have it now, they'll have it shortly.
It sounds that once the experts, they do take that data, that within a couple of weeks they'll be able to get that verification. And then comes to that second claim that we got from the North Koreans. Is it true that if this is a hydrogen bomb, that they would be able to put it onto an ICBM?
Well, they have shown pictures. There was a picture of Kim Jong-un in front of the warhead, together with what seemed like a cone of a missile. Again, that is difficult to prove. Nevertheless, given the status of their program, given the rapidity with which they are developing, if they're not able to do that now, they will do it in the near future. You know, they're not presumably they are not going to test a ballistic missile with a live nuclear warhead. I mean, that is very rare, and that would be a major escalation. The Chinese did it some decades ago. They fired a live nuclear warhead in a ballistic missile, but I can't see the North Koreans doing that. But we have to worst case. We have to prepare for the worst. And if they don't have it now, again, they will have it in the near future. They will be able to fit a nuclear warhead and possibly a thermonuclear warhead to an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Understood, but everything has changed since that test on Sunday. So what is the updated threat assessment? If North Korea did successfully detonate a hydrogen bomb, what is Pyongyang capable of doing?
Well, look, North Korea has the capability to deliver ballistic missiles to intercontinental ranges. We have seen that. They've tested that. Now they will increase the reliability of those weapons, and they'll increase their arsenal over the next few months and years. And we can expect that they will be able to fit a nuclear warhead into an intercontinental ballistic missile and also into an intermediate range ballistic missile. That is, those missiles that are capable of hitting Guam, places such as Tokyo and elsewhere. What we will expect is that they will deploy a thermonuclear force capable of striking the United States. That will come if they are not stopped either physically or through diplomacy over the next few months or years. They will have a sizable force.
Martin Navies of King's College London, we thank you for joining us here in the program. And let's take it back to Rosemary Church. And Rosemary, as you heard just then, incremental progress is definitely being made in North Korea's weapons and nuclear weapons program. Back to you.
It has a lot of people on edge for sure. Christy, we'll come back to you in just a moment. But we do want to turn to another major story that we've been following. CNN has learned that President Trump is expected to end a program that protects hundreds of thousands of young, undocumented immigrants in the U.S. from deportation. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, applies to qualified participants brought to the U.S. illegally as children. Now, Mr. Trump's decision won't be final until he makes that announcement, and that's expected on Tuesday. Sources tell CNN he will give Congress 6 months to pass legislation to fix DACA and allow people covered under it to remain in the U.S. Now, during the presidential campaign, of course, you'd recall Mr. Trump repeatedly promised to end DACA.
We will immediately terminate President Obama's 2 illegal executive amnesties in which he defied federal law and the Constitution to give amnesty to approximately 5 million illegal immigrants.
When somebody's terrific, we want them back here.
Should they have to
but
leave
they have
too?
to be legally. Look, it sounds cold and it sounds hard. We have a country. Our country's going to hell. We have to have a system where people are legally in our country.
We're always talking about dreamers for other people. I want the children that are growing up in the United States to be dreamers also. They're not dreaming right now.
All right, a lot to discuss here. Scott Lucas joins us now. He is a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham in England and the founder and editor of EA Worldview. Thank you so much for being with us. So it's believed that the elimination of DACA will cost employers about $2 billion or so, and the GDP could lose $280 billion over the course of 10 years. So why would the Trump administration get rid of this program?
Well, the reason why we're hearing this is because there are certain advisors, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, the hard-right White House advisor, Steve Miller, who really want to end this program. There are also some state attorney generals that are pressing for the end of it. And Trump himself, of course, has this simple view of, oh, if they're undocumented immigrants, they're not doing us any good. But Rosemary, I actually think the big story is that Trump has taken a step back in the last 24 hours. Because you'll note that what we were talking about is he would make an announcement tomorrow that would immediately terminate the program. Instead, what we're hearing now is, well, we're not going to immediately end DACA. Instead, let's give it over to Congress and let's give them 6 months to, quote, fix it. Now, what I think Trump has done is actually kick the can down the road to Congress. If Congress doesn't remove DACA and replace it, Trump, as he did with the GOP's failure over health care, as the administration is doing over tax cuts, they can say, oh, this failure is Congress's responsibility. It's not ours. Now, it would be hard to predict what will happen with this president. He is prone to change his mind. But I think far from ending DACA, there's actually now a breathing space for it, given that a lot of Republican congressmen, as well as Democrats, actually want to retain the program.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because I did want to discuss that, because if it's 6 months for Congress to come up with that legislation, and it sounds like that would be the answer to keeping these dreamers in the United States, the question is, what form would that legislation take? And also, is there any possibility that some of those dreamers would be sent back to their country of origin and then have to go through the process of coming back into the country legally?
Well, on the first part of the question, Rosemary, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. In other words, if the DACA program is working, and you've just cited the economic evidence that it does, we have evidence from businesses as well as the immigrants that this program is working effectively to keep young people in the U.S. and to be productive, you don't make changes. Now, on the second part of the question as well, what happens in the meantime? The risk is here we go back into another limbo, such as we had, if you might remember, over the Muslim ban on entry into the U.S., where individual agents may take actions. There may be young undocumented immigrants whose status is in limbo, who are unable to establish effective identity checks, and they may be deported. We need to see guidelines from the Justice Department and from the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, on what happens in this 6-month period.
And Scott, while I've got you here, I do want to shift to the other main issue we've been looking at, North Korea. The US is considering, of course, a number of options in response to the testing of that hydrogen bomb, if that is indeed what it is in the end. What was your response to President Donald Trump attacking South Korea's approach to the North, and then Mr. Trump threatening any country doing business with North Korea? How does that help or hinder the situation, and how realistic is that?
My response, Rosemary, is that some folks need to keep Donald Trump off Twitter. And let me be blunt with you here. Threatening South Korea, which is, of course, the country on the front line with the North, is not helpful. It is not realistic to say that we are going to stop trading with China or France or Germany or other countries who actually have economic links with North Korea. So Trump is blowing smoke. Instead, if there is stability, it has come from, for example, the Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who after the White House meeting yesterday tried to reassure allies, said, look, we are going to defend you if North Korea takes any aggressive action, while at the same time saying, but we're not going to push the button. We're not going to take this, to a military showdown. Diplomacy, in the end, is the only way out of this crisis. Trump does not help that with his Twitter activity, so hopefully he'll be put off to the side.
You've been watching this for a very long time, of course, an expert in politics. How concerned should we be in America, across the world, in this sort of brinkmanship that we're watching play out between the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, and Donald Trump?
Oh, of course we should be concerned, Rosemary. I mean, what we're seeing is a couple of alpha males, or rather an alpha male North Korean regime and an alpha male U.S. president, keep poking each other in the chest. And the North Koreans will continue to do this because they know they can wind Trump up. So at some point, we need to take a step back before a mistake occurs. For example, a North Korean missile going off course and hitting, say, Japan. But I also want to say, Rosemary, we have been here before. I lived through decades of the Cold War where we had this threat that someone would take the step too far and move beyond language to a nuclear strike. Thank goodness it never happened. And I'm hopeful it won't in this case. Cooler heads will prevail, I think, on all sides. But we may have to look, for example, to recognizing that we need leadership from China rather than from Washington to make the first steps to negotiations with North Korea.
Yes, the ball does appear to be in China's court right now. Scott Lucas, always a pleasure to talk with you and get your analysis. Many thanks.
Thank you.
I want to take a short break here, but still to come, international reaction is swift, condemning North Korea after it detonates its most powerful nuclear bomb yet. More on that still to come.
Now for a recap of the news that we're following out of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea is responding to Pyongyang's latest nuclear weapons test with its own threat. Defense officials says these military drills show Seoul is willing to wipe out North Korea's leadership and nuclear site. The South Korean general also says that there are signs North Korea is preparing for another missile launch. Meanwhile, a meeting of the BRICS countries is underway in Xiamen, China. We've got leaders from Brazil, India, and South Africa. They're all there attending, as well as the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. He's there with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is hosting. Now, CNN's Andrew Stevens is there. He joins me now with the latest. And Andrew, no doubt, coming up in discussions there at the BRICS summit is a tweet from U.S. President Donald Trump saying, quote, the United States is considering, in addition to other options, stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea. Now, knowing that there are and have been trade links between North Korea and China, does China consider that a direct threat?
China and and also India as well. The leader of India, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is also here. Christy, no doubt this will be a topic of the conversation, but to many people it is such a far-fetched scenario that the US, the world's biggest economy, would cut ties completely with the second biggest economy. We're talking about total direct trade going both ways of about $580 billion, of which US producers would lose about $15 billion in sending their exports to China. So that would have a direct impact on US economic growth as well. In fact, most people will tell you that if Donald Trump went through with that, it would lead to a global recession, which would include recession in the United States as well. So I think it's more of a case, really, that BRIC leaders, as with many analysts, have looked at that statement at face value and said, well, that's just not going to happen. Now, as you say, the BRICS meeting here has gathered 5 leaders from the BRIC countries, including Vladimir Putin. Mr. Putin and President Xi met last night to discuss North Korea, and they pretty much stuck to the same script, which was that they were still pushing for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. They both strongly condemned this latest missile move, but as yet no indication that they were going to change their strategy on how to deal with North Korea, other than sticking to those UN sanctions against North Korea, Christy.
Andrew Stevens joining us live from Xiamen, the site of the BRICS summit. Thank you, Andrew. Now let's bring in CNN's Frederick Pleiken, who joins us live from Moscow. And as mentioned just a moment ago, Fred, we know the Russian President Vladimir Putin is there in Xiamen to attend this summit. He is also addressing North Korea. Do you feel that Putin and Xi are providing a united front in terms of how best to manage the North Korean threat?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin says. He says that China and Russia absolutely see eye to eye on that issue. And it's very interesting to hear what Andrew just said, because the Russians do indeed say that they feel that this latest nuclear launch, which they've condemned, needs to be dealt with by the United Nations. But he also went to say, through his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, that he doesn't believe that sanctions so far are working. And while the Russians are condemning this latest nuclear test, they're also saying cooler heads need to prevail, and there can only be a diplomatic solution to this crisis. I want to read for you a quote by Dmitry Peskov, who's obviously speaking on behalf of Vladimir Putin, is actually with him there in China right now. He says, and this is the quote, Vladimir Putin called on the international community not to yield to emotions and act calmly and in a balanced manner. He also stressed that a comprehensive solution to the nuclear and other problems of the Korean Peninsula can be reached only by political and diplomatic means. It was interesting because people on this call that Dmitry Peskov had then asked him, well, what can that solution be? And he said, look, so far, it really is difficult to tell what is going to be the solution to this. However, one of the things that Russia and China have proposed is what's called a double freeze, where they say, in essence, it's a little more complicated, but in essence, they say the North Koreans need to freeze their nuclear and missile programs, and the U.S. should stop things like these military exercises that have been going on in that region. Of course, there is some self-interest there as well, Christy. Obviously, the Russians don't want to see the U.S. ramping up their military presence in the Pacific region around Korea.
Fred Pleiken reporting live for us from Moscow. Thank you. Now, coming up right here in the program, President Trump responds to North Korea's latest nuclear weapons test. Plus, reports say he plans to end a program that allows thousands of young, undocumented immigrants to work and study in the U.S. The latest on both these stories ahead.
And a very warm welcome back to our viewers here in the United States and all around the world. I'm Rosemary Church in Atlanta.
And I'm Christy Liu Stout in Seoul, South Korea. Now, we want to recap the news that we're following out of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea is responding to Pyongyang's latest nuclear weapons test with these military drills. A defense official says that they're meant to send a message to Pyongyang that Seoul is willing to wipe out its leadership and nuclear test site. A South Korean general also says that there are signs North Korea is preparing for another missile launch. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump sent another message, and it's not likely to be viewed well here in Seoul. He said in a tweet this: South Korea's finding, as I've told them, that their talk of appeasement with North Korea will not work. They only understand one thing. Now, Jean Lee joins me now. She's a CNN contributor, journalist, and a fellow with the Wilson Center. Great to meet you and to see you here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us here on the program. About that tweet that we just read out, that really undercut the alliance between U.S. and South Korea during such a sensitive time. What has been the reaction here to that?
It's a terrible time to be showing a possible rift between the U.S. and South Korea.
Yeah.
This is really a time when the U.S. and South Korea needed to show that they were on the same page. So I'm a little concerned about the lack of unified messaging coming out of the White House and also coming out of these two capitals. And so there's a lot of concern right now that here in South Korea, they're calling it Korea passing. There's some concern that the White House is just bypassing South Korea's interests. And so we're seeing the Blue House here in South Korea really scrambling to assure the South Korean people that the U.S. president will take South Korea's interests at heart and will notify and work with South Korea if there's any kind of strategy or change in strategy.
Interesting turn of phrase there, Korea passing, the feeling that the United States is bypassing South Korea altogether. And if that feeling is here, is there also growing support for South Korea to say, hey, we need to take our security into our own hands?
There are some rumblings here among certain sectors of the population. There are calls for their own nuclear weapons, and this has me concerned. I mean, this is not possible for South Korea. They're a signatory to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but there's a concern here in South Korea that they're not adequately being protected, and so there are some calls for their own nuclear weapons or to bring nuclear weapons back onto into South Korea.
Yeah, you're a South Korea watcher. You're also an avid North Korea watcher as well. Of course, you said at the AP News Bureau in Pyongyang. Got to ask you about the.
There's some room to take away the will or the motivation to continue testing.
Okay, so what is it going to be? What is the additional sanction, the turning of the screw that needs to take place to rein in North Korea?
So if the United Nations Security Council or any other government wishes to really pinch the North Koreans, it's going to be cutting off the fuel supply, cutting off gasoline supply. So when I was there in May, that was the one thing that the North Koreans were really questioning me about. There were long lines at the gasoline stations because they were already anticipating the possibility that China would stop sending fuel. And think about what the ramifications are. If you don't have gasoline, you can't operate tractors, you can't distribute food. It would have massive implications for the North Korean economy. And I think the fact that we didn't see those sanctions in the last round of UN sanctions says something. It's probably China saying, this is where we draw the line because we know the impact it would have on North Korea's livelihood.
Yeah, there's also the final card to play, right, to really have leverage here. Jean Lee, as always, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jean. Now, Rosemary, back to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Christy. We'll get back to you very soon. More now, though, on another major story we have been following. Sources tell CNN President Trump is expected to end an Obama-era program that protects undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, protect them from deportation. Now, they say Mr. Trump will give Congress 6 months to try to fix the program known as DACA through legislation. The president's decision won't be final until it's announced, and that's not expected to happen until Tuesday. Eduardo Samaniego joins us now from Boston, Massachusetts. He is the former executive director of Freedom House and has worked extensively with students, helping them with their DACA applications. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. And of course, you understand the plight of these students. You've helped many of them. So how will these nearly 800,000 people be affected if the Trump administration announces Tuesday that the DACA program will come to an end?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. There is close to 800,000 undocumented immigrants right now who are protected under a deferred action that was enacted by Obama in 2012. I believe that, these immigrants are some of the best that we have in this country. They have, been able to contribute. About 12% of those 800,000 have been able to buy homes. 54% of those have found a better job. About 60% of those have been able to buy a car for the first time. So it is clear how this has, DACA has allowed these students to contribute to our economy and to our way of life. I think that the main thing here is that they're either working or studying through DACA. So if DACA is ended, this will affect, their daily lives and the lives of their families, and in turn that will affect the economy. So, this is huge for this 800,000, young immigrants who have qualified for DACA, because this means that they could be immediately eligible for deportation. And I believe that that is one of the biggest concerns in their community. That if DACA is taken away, these young immigrants will be a target of deportation.
Yeah, certainly very uncertain times for those people. And President Trump is apparently planning to give Congress 6 months to come up with legislation to replace the DACA program. What are you expecting will come from that legislation? Could that, in essence, save the program, do you think?
So I think, that's one of the things that, we need to see Congress act on. Recently, the Senate introduced a new version of the DREAM Act, the 2017 DREAM Act. And we believe that is definitely a bipartisan piece of legislation that has been introduced by both Republican and Democrat senators in the Senate. And so we believe that moving on that plan will be one of the steps that would need to be taken. If DACA was to be ended, that would be a way to protect not only those 800,000 undocumented immigrants, but perhaps that's a pool that could be enlarged to include people that didn't qualify on the first round, either because they were just months into their 16th birthday or months into their 30th birthday, and they couldn't qualify. So either way, there is a piece of legislation waiting on the Senate to be acted upon. And we know that DACA is has the overwhelming support across the United States by both the Republican from Speaker Paul Ryan, Ileana from Florida, both Republican, to all Democrats on the other side. So we know that this is a popular piece of legislation in the United States, and we hope that Congress can act and protect these children, and potentially even move on to protect a little bit more of those 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States.
All right. We will, of course, wait and see. We'll understand that announcement will be made on Tuesday. Thank you so much, Eduardo Samaniego, for joining us and explaining the benefits that the DACA program has brought to so many people, hundreds and thousands. Many thanks. Well, thousands of Rohingya Muslims are leaving Myanmar after days of deadly violence. We'll take a look at the details. That's still ahead. Welcome back, everyone. We will, of course, get back to developments on North Korea in just a moment. But right now, we want to turn to the escalating crisis at the Myanmar-Bangladesh border. Thousands of Rohingya, a stateless ethnic Muslim minority, are fleeing to the border after a deadly week in Myanmar. Refugees tell CNN the army attacked them, but the government blames Rohingya militants for starting the violence with coordinated attacks last Friday. Matthew Smith joins me now from one of those refugee camps in Bangladesh. He is the co-founder and CEO of Fortify Rights, a non-profit human rights organization based in Southeast Asia. Thank you so much for being with us. So talk to us about just how bad this situation is. You've had an opportunity to talk to some of those refugees. What is happening to the fleeing Rohingya population, and what is the truth here? Because we're getting conflicting reports.
Yeah, we're piecing together what's happening. What we know is that the Myanmar, what triggered this was, of course, coordinated attacks by militants on August 25th. But since then, the Myanmar army, Myanmar police force, and armed Rakhine civilians and others have committed mass killings. We're documenting mass killings. We're documenting men, women, and children are getting killed. In some cases, soldiers are opening fire on unarmed groups of civilians and then setting the bodies alight and burning the bodies. It's truly horrific. There are entire village tracts are emptying out, entire villages being burned down. Huge numbers of people are pouring across the border.
They are horrifying details. And of course, Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi has come under a great deal of criticism over the treatment of the Rohingya people. Is she doing enough to help these people? And if not, why not?
Well, unfortunately, since a similar type of violence back in October and November, Aung San Suu Kyi's office has been spreading very, very irresponsible propaganda, deadly propaganda, about the Rohingya population, about what's happening in Rakhine State. We have not seen her office do enough. It's worth mentioning that the main perpetrators in Rakhine State are certainly not the civilian government. It's the state security forces. But we are calling upon Aung San Suu Kyi and her government. These are mass killings that are taking place right now. And her office is not only doing nothing to stop it, but in some ways they're throwing fuel on the fire.
Matthew Smith joining us there from Bangladesh with the details of the horrifying plight for the Rohingya people there. Many thanks for detailing that for us. We appreciate it. And we will be back with more news after this short break. Just stay with us.
Welcome back to Seoul. I'm Christy Lustau, where we are monitoring North Korea's claims that it successfully tested a hydrogen bomb. Now, North Korea has been working toward an arsenal of nuclear-tipped ICBMs for quite some time now. Last year, the regime claimed it had miniaturized a nuclear warhead that it could fit on a ballistic missile. Now, state-run North Korean media showed a spherical device, but whether it was an actual nuclear bomb, that remains unclear. And then last September, the North claimed to have successfully detonated a nuclear warhead, although many experts were skeptical. And in July, the regime claimed to have conducted its first successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And then Saturday, North Korean state media claimed that the country had developed its first hydrogen bomb, releasing this photo with the announcement. Now, the same day, North Korea announced that it had tested a hydrogen bomb, and the U.S. Geological Survey measured a 6.3 magnitude quake at the same location as previous missile tests. And we spoke to a guest earlier from King's College London who says, based on the evidence presented as of now, looking at the shock waves, the USGS data, as well as the history of North Korean nuclear tests up to now, he believes that there is a very high probability that, yes, the North Korean claim is correct. They have tested a hydrogen bomb. They have detonated its most powerful bomb yet. Rosemary, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Christy. I want to turn now to the U.S. state of California. More than 1,000 firefighters in Los Angeles are battling a fire that's consumed more than 2,800 hectares. That's about 7,000 acres. Officials say the La Tuna blaze is the largest fire the city has ever seen. The California governor declared a state of emergency for the area. The fire started Friday and is now only 30% contained. Well, the mayor of Houston, Texas, says his city is 95% dry and mostly operational. Still, floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey could take another 2 weeks to fully recede in some areas. The storm killed at least 53 people and tens of thousands are still living in temporary shelters.
The population size and the geographic size is far larger than Katrina and I think Sandy combined. We have over 5 million people who are affected by this. It's not just the flooding in Houston, it's the hurricane swath all the way from Corpus Christi over to Beaumont. And so it's going to require even more than what was funded for Katrina, which was about $120 billion.
And people throughout southeast Texas are returning to their homes to take a look at the damage Harvey caused. One woman in Houston got a welcome surprise amid all that devastation. CNN's Rosa Flores was there.
Authorities say that they conducted more than 36,000 rescues. Now, that doesn't include Good Samaritans helping others. We caught up with one woman who was rescued by her neighbor, and our cameras were rolling when she reunited with her rescuer.
The house right across the street. Those are the people who came and got me out the water. My son couldn't come get me. And they don't even know how to speak English, but they came and got me. And I want to thank them because I called for help and they couldn't get to me. But that young man, he said, "Don't worry, Mommy, I got you." And he don't even know me. He didn't even know my name. I didn't even know his name. He pushed me on a walker from here all the way to Lay Road, 5 blocks in the water, way up to his neck here and on my neck at the same time. This is my hero right here. This is my hero. Yeah, I appreciate you so much. Because you didn't have to do it, but you did. And I appreciate you so much. And then we And when I fell in the water, his baby say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. She's 4 years old. Mommy, we didn't want to hurt you." So I want to thank them for looking out for me. And they took and brought me to my pastor's house. That's the only way I was able to get out this water.
No importa tipo de raza, todos somos familia.
He says that everyone is family. It doesn't matter what race you are. He says that everyone is family. Take a look at these pictures. This is what that neighborhood looked like during the storm. Now, we should also add that Javier Ramirez was also trying to take his pregnant wife and 3 daughters to safety. Rosa Flores, CNN, Houston.
It is a powerful story. Thanks for your company. I'm Rosemary Church in Atlanta.
And I'm Christy Lou Stout in Seoul, South Korea, where the nation is holding live fire drills as a show of force targeting North Korea after its nuclear test over the weekend. For our viewers in the United States, stick around. Early Start is next.
And for everyone else, stay tuned for more news with Max Foster in London. Enjoy your day.